Hello, I'm Nick Tyrone. Welcome to Neoliberal Centrist Dad. Thank you all who watched last week. I had a great chat with Nick Cohen about on the topic of will Trump be the one who destroys Brexit, and we got through lots of different things, all sorts of things about the crazy world in which we live, and actually reflecting on it, it was a very difficult chat for me at times, simply because there was sort of so much to say, and yet actually trying to come up with something unique to say or original to say about the situation in the world is difficult because it's so baffling at the moment, I think. But if you haven't seen that or heard that, please go back and you can check it out on the channel. And while you're there, please like and subscribe. Before we kick off, obviously thanks to Bloomsbury Radio and the Bloomsbury Institute for hosting and producing today. Thanks as always to Bara, my great producer. So now we'll get into what this is, which is sort of a continuation of the conversation I had with Nick last week. Then we discussed around Trump and Brexit, and will Trump be the one who destroys Brexit? I've been thinking since then about the idea of, will Trump be the one who destroys the populist right in Europe? So I will explain what I mean by that. And also, please hang on. There's lots of stuff coming up. I've got that in the first portion of the program. Will Trump destroy the populist right in Europe? And then I get on to Trump and Canada, which I have some insight into, and this idea of what he's trying to do with Canada, and that involves all sorts of stuff. We've got, Game of Thrones references, all sorts of great stuff coming up. We've got, zombies with mullets. I promise that's going to be great, worth staying just for that. And then the final part of the video, I'm going to be talking a little bit of a housekeeping thing about Brexit. Lots of people are asking me some questions about Brexit, so what I'll do is I'll just mop that up at the very end. Right, so one of the major themes of right-wing populism for the last decade has been vocal support for Trump, and Trump has been seen as a hero figure amongst a lot of the populist right throughout Europe. He's often name-checked, and in a sense, a lot of what populist rightism in Europe has been is a sort of idea, either explicit or tacit, that what they want to do, whoever that is, whether it's the AfD in Germany or Front National in France, is and Geert Wilders' outfit in Holland. I'm just trying to think of what they're called, and it's escaping me, but you know who I mean. With the idea that, in a sense, what they want to do is take Trumpism, or some sort of version of Trumpism, into their own countries. So what Trump is trying to do in America, they are trying to do in France, Germany, Holland, wherever. Obviously, Viktor Orban is also a key figure in that, not just in his case, not just in the sense of trying to bring Trumpism to Hungary, but that he was a sort of precursor to Trump and an inspiration to some degree for Trumpism. In fact, I think there's always these comparisons that get made with Trump and Putin, Trump and Hitler, all that, if you're going really far with this, or Trump and Stalin. But actually, the coziest and the easiest to justify in terms of comparisons is Donald Trump and Viktor Orban. Partially because I think Trump's doing a sort of Orbanism intentionally and consciously. So there's been all this love bombing, if you like, of the populist right in Europe towards Trump, and it's been reciprocal. I mean, we've seen how Trump had these, he talked up these right-wing parties in Europe for many years, and that followed on to the current era where we have Elon Musk and his open backing of Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. And obviously in Britain, you can then just neatly come on to Nigel Farage and obviously his relationship with Trump, getting his picture taken in gold lifts, and obviously just speaking at Trump rallies and openly espousing the idea of Trump being president. And I think there was a sort of synergy there between the populist right in Britain and throughout Europe and Trump. It's the idea that the old liberal order was crumbling, and Trump represented some sort of breakthrough, some sort of new era that was going to correct the mistakes of the liberal order and create a great new future. And now we're seeing in Trump 2.0, it's created a huge amount of problems, I think, immediately. And even within, it's amazing to think, but we're only a few weeks into Trump 2.0, but already I think it's creating huge problems for populist figures of the right. I think actually the problems The main problems are twofold. One is that Trump's policies, his policy platform, seems to be failing to some extent. We've seen the crash of the stock market and stocks falling, and we're already seeing some negative outcomes from the tariff war that he's sort of just begun on, but the feeling that could get a lot worse. And I think one of the problems with that as well is that a lot of the stuff that he's pushing, like the tariffs, are, well, I mean, to put it bluntly, not very traditionally right-wing. So they're about as far as from Reagan and Thatcher, really, in economic terms, as it's really possible to get. I mean, the idea that Thatcher would have ever thought that, having a trade war between Britain, Europe, America, China was ever a good idea, at once was ever a good idea is pretty much impossible to imagine. Never mind what Reagan would have thought about it. So, to the point where actually nationalizing whole chunks of industry wouldn't be that odd in the sense of what actually Trump's doing. So I think that will be odd for right-wingers, people who are at least economically right-wing, to try and support what Trump's doing on the tariffs, particularly given, and that comes to the second problem, and it's even more acute for populist right leaders throughout Europe, is that, Trump's become, his policy, and even in terms of how his rhetoric has become very anti-European. So he's placing huge tariffs on European goods, he's threatening even more tariffs, and he's threatening the very basis of European security in many ways, but not least of which is the way he's handling the conflict between Putin and Ukraine and Putin. So really, I mean, if you're a populist right-winger in Europe, this creates a huge dilemma. And actually, we're already seeing a split on the European right in this regard. In Britain, you're seeing it in the form of, say, I mean, a very good recent example would be Douglas Murray. He wrote an article in The Spectator, basically, I mean, slamming Trump for his approach to Ukraine and talking about how we have to support Ukraine and how the future of the West is dependent on that. And I would agree with Douglas on that wholeheartedly. But it is a disagreement with Trump, however you want to slice it. We've seen Dan Hannan, obviously the sort of ultra-Brexiteer, writing about the importance of defending sovereignty and the territorial rights of Ukraine. He's done a lot of that on various outlets. And again, from Hannan's perspective, that makes perfect sense. If your whole rationale for Brexit was national sovereignty being of the utmost importance and a sort of key idea, a key ideological guide, then how can you stand by while that's being stomped all over in Ukraine? It just doesn't make any sense. And so fair enough to these guys for not going along with what would have been easy, I think, and actually just going along with Trump and what he's trying to do, whatever that is, with Russia, Ukraine. And on that, really, we're seeing the split, a sort of a micro version of this that we're seeing that's playing out this week, is the split we're seeing within the Reform Party, or at least with the Reform-associated right, if that makes sense. Particularly the spat between Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe. Rupert Lowe having the whip taken off him, and now Farage saying something along the lines of, there's no road back for Lowe within the Reform fold. And although it's slightly different in some senses, because it's not explicitly about Ukraine in any sense, it is a kind of that split between the Reagan-Thatcherite worldview that you're seeing sort of upheld in a way between the Douglas Murray, the Dan Hannans, and sort of the other end of the right, which has really drunk the Trump Kool-Aid to a large extent and are essentially embracing worldviews. I mean, I'm being harsh here, really, but it's not that dissimilar to Stalinism when you really get down to the basics. It's about tariffs, it's about protectionism, it's about nationalism, really not about the free market or an open society. And a lot of it being done in lots of instances simply to own the libs. I have no idea. Offhand, I don't know Rupert Lowe's views on Ukraine, but he has gone very hard on immigration. I think way past the point where most of the right are, as well as saying things like Tommy Robinson. He says something about Tommy Robinson not being given the credit he deserves for grooming gangs, and that's a big divide between him and Farage. Farage obviously was put on the spot about the whole Tommy Robinson thing, and very much came out, was sort of like, doesn't want to be associated with Tommy Robinson. And I think Lowe has sort of gone the other way, and I think that sort of seems to be where the divide lies. Farage is right, incidentally, in this particular instance. I mean, I know a lot of long-term readers to my Substack and a lot of listeners to this program will find it odd me saying those words. Farage is right, but I think it's worth saying in this particular instance. It's worth at least crediting him on stuff like the Tommy Robinson stuff, and actually drawing a line between some of the rhetoric that Lowe is saying on, you know, the vast deportations and repatriations and things like that. I mean, because credit where credit's due. Actually, if you look at his track record, Farage is very clever. There was an article, I think it might have been in The Spectator this week, another Spectator article, about all the people Farage has had all these run-ins with, these tussles over the years. And, you know, the idea being Farage is just constantly, you know, battling people and having all these, you know, these you know, that he's a combative figure, and was sort of the essence of the article. But actually, I got two things out of it that I think were at least slightly unintentional on the part of the author of the piece. One is that if you look at all the people that Farage has had all these dust-ups with over the years, actually all of them have sort of just been consigned to the dustbin of political history, really. You know, they are the losers, and Farage is the one leading a poll that's, you know, it's leading national polls. He's the leader of the leading party in the polls. And whatever you think about his politics, and they are not mine, you sort of have to slightly tip your hat to that. And yes, he's had a lot of battles, but again, like, he's won them all. And so, you know, that's a big thing. And then the other thing is the political press. That's really that was the big story this week. There's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot the political press could talk about, but it was amazing how much so many podcasts, news programs, news articles, blog posts, you name it, had felt that they had to touch on the Rupert Lowe, Nigel Farage spat. And to some extent, that actually speaks to how much energy seems to be going in the direction of reform. So I think I'll close this section on the fact that there was a poll on Rupert Lowe done. I think it was YouGov, but I'm sorry if I got this wrong, and it was Opinium or someone else. But one of the big pollsters in Britain did a poll asking voters about Rupert Lowe, and the vast majority of them had no idea who he was. And actually, the most killer stat in the whole thing was 7 in 10 Reform voters didn't know who Rupert Lowe is. And so it's kind of a great example, actually, of the difference between, you know, the online world and the real world, at least as it stands in early 2025, and that there is a big difference, and that a lot of the people who are saying they would vote Reform are not doing so because they've seen something on Twitter or any other social media outlet. They're basically saying they like whatever it is. And I mean, a lot of the times it's just Farage, or a lot of it's just change. But I think that is something for the online right to bear in mind as we're talking about the online right and how they're going to, populist right, and how they're going to deal with a slightly new era that I think we're in with Trump 2.0. So there's a split, and I think this split's happening repeatedly all down to, you know, across Europe, and it really is, Trump is either explicitly or tacitly the dividing line. You know, do you stay with the Trump project, or do you reject it for the sake of, you know, whatever it is, French nationalism, German nationalism, some sort of pan-European nationalism, whatever it is. You know, I think it's going to be increasingly hard for elements of the European populist right to cling to Trump. And what's going to be interesting is how they maneuver that, and how they move away from Trump, and what are the mechanisms they use, and what are the dividing lines. And we're seeing it with Ukraine, but what are they going to be in 6 months' time? Are they going to attack Trump on the economy and how the tariffs directly, and how he's his overall economic policy and how it pertains to the rest of the West? will be interesting to see. I think it's important to note, though, here, I know a lot of the people who listen to this, who will be watching this, who read my stuff, a lot of them are on the center left, and so I think there might be a hint of, oh, well, this is going to mean right-wing populism in Europe is going to die out, or it's going to disintegrate. We're going to see loads of it's kind of going to die a death of 1,000 different parties. So the whole populist right is going to splinter and going to become a mess, and thus, by the very nature of that, become much less of an electoral threat. But I don't think that's going to happen. I want to sound a note of pessimism here, because I think there's a lot that populism in the right could do, actually, if it figures out pretty quickly that they have to slightly distance themselves from Trump. And I think we're starting to see that happen. So, for instance, I don't see anti-immigrant sentiment getting any more liberal anytime soon across anywhere in Europe, particularly. I think we're probably going to see it move further and further to the right, as in anti-immigrant sentiment is going to grow as the 2020s progress. I'm saying that as a liberal who doesn't like to see that happen and doesn't want that to happen, but by the same token, can I see that happening? Yes, I certainly can. And I think a lot of social issues are going to move to the right over the next 5 years or so, and given that, there's just going to be a lot of fertile ground for right-wing populism in Europe if they get the Trump question right. And particularly, you can see what Farage is trying to do. He's clearly trying to reel in more traditional Tory voters, more just solidly centre-right voters, because there's a lot more of them. There's a lot of them to be had, and a lot of them are annoyed at the Conservative Party. And while that's the case, Farage, if he gets it right, can hoover them up. But again, I mean, they really, really need to distance themselves from Trump as quickly as possible, or I think they're going to be in serious trouble. So that will be interesting to see how they manage that over the coming months and years. So thoughts on... I'm going to move now sort of to part two. Let me just have a quick swig of tea. And thoughts on Trump in Canada. I mean, I'll preface this by saying I think some of you may know, some of you may not know, I grew up in Canada. I grew up in a fairly unfashionable bit of Canada, which was Alberta. Me and Jordan Peterson, there you go. And so I do have some firsthand kind of, idea of this. It's not abstract to me, at least talking about this. I can kind of give you at least some perspective firsthand on this. I'd say the first things to say is it's amazing how much Trump's vitriol towards Canada and his whole 51st state rhetoric has revitalized the Liberal Party in Canada. That's Trudeau's party. And if they win the next Canadian general election, which the polls suggest they've got a good shot at doing, I mean, it will be almost entirely down to Donald Trump, which is astounding, really. And really, I think, really demonstrates that if the Liberal Party win, it will really demonstrate for right-wing, centre-right parties, any parties to the right across the Western world, what a danger actually being associated with Trump, again, either explicitly or tacitly, can do to your electoral fortunes. Because I'm telling you, if the Liberals win, it will be down to Trump. It will be down to the fact that he has changed the mood in Canada so drastically that the Tories, who were completely cruising in the polls and just seemed completely odds on to win that election, have somehow, that hasn't happened really because of Trump. So that would be amazing. I think it seems to me within MAGA there's a huge ignorance of Canada, which isn't surprising. There's a lot of ignorance of Canada from Americans in general. I mean, I remember when I was touring across the States in the 90s, and I mean, you could be in a town that was like 20 miles from the Canadian border, and people would have as much knowledge of Canada as if they, were in... had grown up thousands of miles away. I mean, it was amazing, the sort of level of ignorance and just general, don't really care about Canada that a lot of Americans have. And I think he's probably just looking at this big, sort of zone of the North, and it's this frozen tundra, and he's just going to march in. I think what he's really underestimated, and we're seeing it in terms of, the things like the booing of the national anthem, the American national anthem at Canadian ice hockey matches and things like that. I mean, really what it comes down to is how there's a real course of anti-Americanism that flows through Canadians. And I think a big one is I mean, part of it's an identity thing. I think, what is the Canadian identity? And to some extent, it really does come down to we're North American but not Americans. And so that will just automatically, I think, trigger a huge response if you have an American president saying, well, Canada is or should be the 51st state. Canadians really focus a lot of ire on America in lots of soft ways, but I think that can be made hard by the approach that Trump is making. So I remember I had a T-shirt that my parents sent me once. It was something about like I'm Canadian, and we had a whole bunch of stuff. But the amazing thing about the list was it was so entirely geared towards an American audience. That was the amazing thing. It was something like our money isn't monopoly money, which again, from any European perspective, doesn't make any sense, because what that refers to is the fact that the Canadian money is in different colors, unlike the American money, which is all green. Again, which just wouldn't make any sense to a European. I mean, it's like, well, yeah. We wouldn't have thought your money was monopoly money, but there you go. There's a real sort of dormant anger towards America that I think Trump has unleashed. And I would probably just say that, having grown up in a particular part of Canada that's a bit rough, I would advise Trump to think carefully about his plans. I mean, I don't think he really wants to march into Alberta or Saskatchewan, particularly during the winter when it's 40 below. It's full of guys who are pretty hard. And, in the 1990s, I moved from Canada to Manchester. And I lived in a pretty rough part of Manchester, actually. And yet, actually, I felt so much safer than I did where I had lived in Canada, because it was really rough. It was, bar fights and, I think people have this idea of Canada who haven't been there, or if they've been there, they've been to, Vancouver for a day, or they've been to Toronto or Quebec or somewhere where, a lot of the rest of Canada is actually pretty wild and pretty rough and pretty violent, actually, if I'm being brutally honest. And, alcoholism, violence, really, it is that thing of it's minus 40 for half the year and people sit around and they get drunk, and there's a lot of violence at the end of it. And I think, I'm just saying to Trump that if he thinks he can march into Saskatchewan, I think he's going to find, a sort of an army of 300-pound guys with mullets they're not going to take kindly to it. So anyway, just a warning to Trump on that. In terms of trying to figure out what Trump's doing, I have no idea. Of all the things that he's doing, actually, it's the whole his whole approach to Canada seems the stupidest to me by quite some ways. Really, really odd. Because I just don't see what the end game is. I could only, again, say that I think it just comes from a complete misunderstanding of Canada and Canadians and how they might take to the idea of being called the 51st state, which, as we're seeing, is not very kindly at all. So how he gets out of that, I don't know. I think Trump's really blown it. I have to say, it was funny watching the Canadian Tories having to really spin their way out of, the whole being seen to be in any way associated with Donald Trump's presidency. Paul Revere with his whole, we'd be tougher on Trump than anyone, and everybody kind of going, well, yeah, but would you? I don't know. So anyway, that's one to watch. I'm trying to think I guess Carney has to call the election, doesn't he? So one to watch, because I think that, again, what happens in Canada will be very instructive for populists in Europe. If the Liberals win, they really have to think about their approach to Trump big time. So anyway, I'll close the Trump section there, and I will, the final part of this video, some of you, I can imagine you will be time-stamping this, because so many of the people, a huge portion of my audience, and it's perfectly understandable why, really want to hear me talk and write about Brexit, because it's a thing that animates them. And obviously, I had a Substack for 3 years, which was based on the sort of madness of Brexit. And look, I haven't changed my opinion about Brexit at all. I haven't. I still think it was the greatest mistake that Britain's ever made, and I think it's. I would always try and, if there were opportunities to come up to genuinely campaign for Britain to rejoin the European Union, I would happily go along with it. It's just that I think this is really important to say just generally about how the media works, how political commentary works. I wrote it for 3 years, and I sort of ran out of things to say about Brexit. I sort of said my piece on Brexit, really. And part of that was actually there were no real exterior things to really talk about. I mean, the most exciting thing that's happened in the world of Brexit over the past few years has probably been the Lib Dems saying if they were in government or part of a government, they would push for Britain to rejoin the customs union or have a customs union of some description with the European Union, which I'm sorry to say is just really lame. That just doesn't excite me in any way. I want to rejoin the EU. If there's a campaign to rejoin the EU, well, I'll be part of it. But the best that we can get, so basically we have the Tories, Labour, Reform, basically the three main parties, at least in terms of polling, all essentially being pro-Brexit or saying, at the very worst, saying we need to make the best of it. And then all we have is the Lib Dems and their customs union, sort of lame fig leaf. And I'm sorry, I just sort of, I'm like, well, look, I'd sort of hoped, when I started in 2021, I sort of hoped by the middle of 2024 that there would be way more movement. There'd be way more stuff happening. There'd be a real, genuine, concerted campaign. But these things come and go. I mean, I remember hearing months back about there was something, wasn't there? I mean, maybe I've imagined this. So, if I've made this up, actually, I'm really sorry. But there was supposed to be some campaigning group that was either led by or involving Alistair Campbell. That was going to be around, making the case for rejoining the EU. What's happened to that? I haven't seen anything about that. Again, to the point that I'm wondering if I've made it. I apologize to Alistair Campbell just up front if I've made this up because where is it? I just don't see it. I mean, if I'm thinking about I really want to get more involved in campaigning to rejoin the European Union. If you ask me what to do, I'd say I don't know. I don't know where to go. I don't know what to tell you. I genuinely don't know, and that kind of got for me to think to pivot and do something slightly different and talk about different things and write about different things. Again, I want to stress, not because I've changed my mind on Brexit, but because I really did run out of things to say on Brexit, and I felt like I was sort of spinning it, and I just couldn't do it. And actually, I want to make a strange comparison to close this podcast with Jordan Peterson. So Jordan Peterson spoke recently in London at a thing called the ARC conference. It must be the ARC conference. I was about to say festival, but I think it's a conference. And I was there for bits of it. And Peterson spoke a couple of times. He spoke once when it was an interview with Farage, which I have to say, Farage just sort of wiped the floor with him. It was kind of embarrassing from Peterson's perspective. Farage was so much more fluent and just came off so much better and really got what he wanted out of it, whereas Peterson seemed a bit lost. To be fair, I've always kind of held out about Jordan Peterson in terms of when he talks about politics explicitly, he's actually not very good. It's not really his métier, and I think he was slightly forced into that by events. And he comes across, sitting across from someone like Farage, he is, I guess, going to come across as a bit weak on that. But it was a bit, I think, unfortunate from a Peterson perspective. But then he gave some sort of speech. He gave a speech at the end, or near the end of the conference. And it was a very, very strange thing. I haven't seen it online. I haven't gone looking for it, to be fair. So maybe it's online somewhere. Or maybe it isn't. I don't know. But he did this very strange thing where he closed his eyes the whole time when he was speaking. And every once in a while, he had this symphony, like an orchestra, symphony orchestra on the stage with him, or near the stage. And he would sort of cue them to play a piece of music. And it was very odd and very pretentious. Anyway, you're wondering why I brought this up in terms of Brexit, and I'll loop it back, which is what I get the sense of with Peterson, or what I got the sense of from Peterson at the ARC conference, was he's sort of run out of things to say on the topics that people want him to speak about. Maybe he has some totally other thing that he wants to speak about. And I generally, he's not going to, Jordan Peterson's not going to take advice from me, and possibly nor should he, but if he did, if somehow, Albertans coming together in a room and he wants to know my opinion, I would just say, look, you had this thing and you talked about all these things and you had a lot to say about them, but it sort of feels like you've kind of run out of things to say on those topics. and yet you're sort of being forced into this thing, or forced is a harsh thing. I mean, it sounds like he's doing it at gunpoint, but you know what I mean? I think commercial realities or what have you have sort of shoved him towards having to continue to talk about certain things that he's just sort of run out of things to say about. And now maybe that's my interpretation of events, and actually Jordan Peterson would completely disagree with that in every way. So maybe possibly, but it did make me think about the whole idea of stopping talking about Brexit in the way that I was, because I just think there's a thing you have to watch for. I know there's a lot of people who would like me to talk about Brexit, and there's a sort of way I could monetize some of that, way I could at least get an audience in for that. And I would just rather not do that, because I would rather speak about things that I'm genuinely interested in talking about, that I think are generally important for the moment in which I'm saying it. And I think for the moment, there's really not that much I can say about Brexit. That might change, and I actually hope it will change in future. And I'd be happy to write about Brexit in more detail if I felt there was more to say. And so I do want to just address some people. I've got some emails from people over the last couple months about, like, why can't you go back to writing about Brexit, nothing but Brexit? And you were so great when you talked about Brexit. It all gave us hope that we were going to rejoin the European Union. And now that you're not writing about it anymore, we all feel depressed about it. And I'm like, genuinely, I'm sorry that if my writing gave you some hope, and now I'm not writing about Brexit, and so that's been taken away. I mean, I genuinely, I'll say sorry that you feel that way. I just feel like you've really got to watch in this day and age for audience capture, and you really got to watch out for just saying the things that you think people want to hear, because I think over time that gets to be really stale and really old, and I don't want to be on a stage somewhere in a year's time with my eyes closed, babbling incoherently about Brexit while I cue a symphony orchestra to play every 5 minutes, because actually it's a gimmick to get around the fact that I don't have anything to say about Brexit anymore, or everything that I wanted to say I have said. So anyway, I wanted to close on that, just simply because I've been getting lots of emails and stuff. And yeah, we'll end it there. I hope you've enjoyed. I'm Nick Tyrone, neoliberal centrist dad. I nailed it this time. I never do at the end. And thank you for listening, and thank you for watching, and we will see you soon.